Okay, we're up and live. Welcome to everyone in the room. Welcome those of you online. We'll just go over the brief rules again, as we've gone over several times in this committee. We're getting good at it now. If you have a cell phone, please leave it on, because if it goes off, you buy donuts. Although those that were here last week will remember somebody's phone went off in this committee, and we faced the problem, nobody wanted to rat them out. So we still didn't get donuts. So if your phone goes off, we prefer maple glazed and chocolate glazed. With that in mind, we got a couple of issues this morning that perhaps will generate some emotional response. And so I would ask everybody testifying and the committee to be respectful, be ethical, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it seems like we're going into the fifth week now. I need a recording. We'll just play these things over and over, but everybody's done very well so far. And I appreciate that continuing for another 4 weeks. With that in mind, this morning, we're going to hear 3 bills: 172, evidence preservation; 119, medical prescriptions off-label purposes; and 65, 988, suicide prevention. I believe Representative Eklund's going to lead us off and tell us all about evidence preservation. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, committee, thank you for having me here. It's good to see you all. This bill is the result of a constituent-driven incident that happened with someone in my area. It was a friend of our children's that kind of disappeared from their circle of friends. She was part of that, and she disappeared at age 16. And here, years later, I kind of get the whole story of what had happened to her. She was raped at 16, pregnant at 16, and the perpetrator, or the person she was with, was 15 years older. And he went to jail for child pornography, and then got out of jail. She married him. This is a kind of a sad story, but she married him and had more children. She had 1 before he was in prison, and then 3 afterwards, 3 girls. And then here we are years later. She's trying to dissolve the marriage and the relationship, and she's in a custody battle with these 3 daughters over that, as well as the divorce that's going on. And it's got to be 15 or so years later. I haven't really figured the numbers out. So in that custody battle, she found that the evidence, basically a rape kit, had been disposed of, and apparently it happens at 5 to 7 years. It just goes away. And so the bill seeks to just require that the evidence be kept for a longer period of time. And I'm looking through the bill. The meat of this bill begins on page 1, and then page 2 says the evidence will be kept for a minimum of 10 years, whereupon the death of the victim. So it would be 10 years past that date when the victim would die, and then kept for 50 years if they remain alive. So something that's unclear to me in this is we reinserted some stricken language when we were in Judiciary Committee, and that was the part that a court order could be changed. This evidence could be changed by a court order. I wasn't sure I liked that, and so it doesn't show in here. We'd have to clarify that. I would like for that to be kept in. Members of the Judiciary Committee said that it would probably be to the benefit of the public if the court is able to rule at some point in time on this evidence. I didn't like it at the time. I mulled it over and then thought about other cases, and I think for the protection of everybody involved, we have to trust the court would be able to make a good decision in matters like this that are kind of sticky. And one of the things I left out in that story is after she married, and I think it's part of why the evidence went away. After she married, she recanted on all of everything and just said, no, I just lied about it all. But she was under control of this man. So that's kind of what brought the bill. And my big concern with it after I started researching it was how much evidence that law enforcement would have to keep, how much storage can you have, because 50 years is a long time. And I'd be open to maybe reducing that. But what we're talking about is probably not all of the evidence, but especially a rape kit in this case. So that is a bill, and I could stand for questions. Hopefully I haven't left out any parts of the story.
Question, Senator Dockstader.
Thank you, Representative Eklund. Life is sometimes complicated, isn't it? Let's look at your 10-year mark. How'd you settle on that? And were there any concerns from law enforcement? Some places are small, may struggle with storage. Other places are well organized. Any feedback on that?
Representative.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the feedback I got was kind of the opposite of that. The smaller departments said, we always keep this evidence. It just isn't something we would ever throw out. The larger ones who have considerably more evidence to store were probably areas of great concern. I think we might have some testimony from them, and they can speak for themselves at some point.
Thank you.
Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, yeah, I'm concerned about all the dates here. Most states keep it forever. I mean, and what happens is, because this reaches way beyond a case of what you're talking about. When someone gets put in prison, they often find, well, wait a minute, this person was, did a rape over here in another state, because they have collaborative databases now that go across the nation. So I am concerned that, so where the bill says no evidence, record, report, or other examination results or analysis collected or created under subsection A of this section shall be destroyed, period, is where it ought to be. I mean, all these stipulations, the courts can come in, and if there's a specific case, they could come in and say, hey, we want to get rid of this. Let them fight it out, but this puzzles me why we're putting these stipulations on page 2, line 2 through 6.
You meant to say, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
Well, I'm wanting to see what the.
Yeah, I'm just asking you for it as a question. Further questions, committee?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, sir.
baffles me too. And you have such a wide disparity of, discretion by the police departments, because some say it's 5 to 7 years they could get rid of it. Others say, no, policy is we will keep that evidence pretty much forever. 50 years is about forever for those people involved. So at any rate, something fell through the cracks in this evidence that would have been beneficial to this young woman who I believe was violated as a child. It fell through the cracks, and there was the evidence disappeared that would have helped her at a later date.
Further questions, committee? Senator Barlow, and I would add in here, I remember, perhaps Senator Barlow remembers as well, this committee in a previous life and previous makeups has heard about a backlog of sexual evidence kits, which is a totally different, it's the same topic, but it's a different topic about kits that have been kept and never been processed. But go ahead, Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I kind of like the leanings of or what I've heard is the leanings committee, that maybe we should look at a longer timeline or something. But I also want to point out that pursuant to a court order, if someone, there are cases, and I'm not suggesting, I'm hoping our criminal justice system does it correctly, where someone is accused and convicted, and then there is subsequent DNA evidence that rules them out, maybe as the perpetrator for that crime, for that particular crime. Maybe they've, so the court order, you know, if there's evidence out there that's maybe erroneous or tainted, we would want that to be dealt with in some way. So anyway, I'm just contemplating this as I'm listening to the testimony. But anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead and follow.
So let me throw this scenario at you because this is what I think happened. Typically what happens when you have a case that starts and then someone says, well, it wasn't that way, or they changed their story, they recanted, and the courts actually take all the evidence and toss it. Because, and you'll see it on the docket somewhere, but everything is gone. I mean, the files and everything are thrown away. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because there could be a frivolous case that gets thrown out and all the evidence gets thrown away. So I think we're kind of crossing over those two things that are happened on one side. That doesn't necessarily mean we should do something on this side, although I like the first part of the bill here. Does that make sense to you, Representative?
Mr. Chairman, it does. As I mulled over what we do with the court order, which could reverse what I'm trying to do, it seems like, I had to think of a case that Representative Barlow and I dealt with on the House floor, in which there was DNA evidence that should have exonerated a man. I also had to think about a jury trial that a close family member was on, in which a bunch of kids conjured up a story that could easily be proven false, and the court sorted that out. And in both cases, in part of the case, I have to trust law enforcement by law will do what needs to be done to protect victims, and the court will also protect victims that may be perceived to be perpetrators. I just think that I have to trust that the court will sort that out, and I think they do. So I would agree. And if there is discrepancy on this, the stricken language was put back in, and we've been in a flurry of paperwork, and this is the first time I've seen this engrossed Senate version. And the stricken language, it was a little different than this, but it just simply, except subject to a court order, was left in the bill. And I could bring that to the committee, but I think you could change it here and make sure that's part of the record from the Senate side.
Okay, very good. Further questions, committee? Senator Hutchins.
My question to you, because I'm in agreement here, I think this is too short a period. I think it should be kept in forever, because we don't know what will happen. So with the court's order, do we find that elsewhere in statute about a court ordering evidence to be tossed out? Maybe we can just refer to that instead of just, I don't know, it's kind of a tricky little question here.
Representative Eklund.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that either. This is out of my wheelhouse, but there may be people here that do know how often. I think that it is, because it was attorneys on the House Judiciary Committee that brought that back to that stricken language back to the bill. And so I think it's done, but there may be other people in the room that would know the answer to that. I don't.
Okay. We'll save that question if somebody may come forward. Any other questions for Representative Eklund? Seeing none. Thank you very much. Stand by. Okay, let's go to the room first. Is there anybody from any of the departments or agencies who wish to testify? I don't see anybody here from department. Well, I see one department. I don't think he's here for that one. Okay, anyone else in the room wish to testify to this bill? Come forward. Come on up and fill one of the seats. We have 4 empty seats. all warm, all comfortable. Mics that work great. The view is wonderful. Go ahead and introduce yourself and go ahead and testify.
Thank you, Chairman Baldwin and senators here. I just wanted to share a little bit on evidence. I was a deputy in Park County, Colorado. I worked in evidence there.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Susan Lone. I'm in House District 411, so you know. I was a deputy up there and I did evidence. And I worked in a lot of cases that, we find we'd have to get rid of evidence after the court order came, but also that we based it on statute of limitations. And so there were certain crimes, that we had to get rid of the evidence in that. And the judges usually were the ones who made the decision on when a court was finished. And that's when we had a certain time, we had to clear out our evidence room. And I also worked as evidence here in Laramie County. And I participated in a time when we had to get rid of the evidence, and a lot of those were drug-related things. And so a lot of it, I learned, was dependent upon the judges and also upon, statute of limitations. And so that's why I have a little bit of trouble with this bill, making a decision, overruling possibly a judge. I'm not sure. But I just wanted to share that and give you something else to think on.
Questions, committee? Senator Doxey.
When you say clear out, done, thrown away?
Yes,
No
we
more.
had methods of how we had to destroy things. As far in a drug situation, we had to burn them, and in different situations, we had to destroy them correctly. It wasn't just tossing it in the trash can. So.
Further questions, Senator Bouchard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how long ago was that? Because I know that Colorado also has a DNA database for, and I don't know
Yes.
how that works, but I know that they have caught people that were rapists and then, traveled through the system even outside of the state.
Right.
So.
Chairman Baldwin and Senator Bouchard, yes, that is correct. When I was in there, that was back in the 90s. And so we kept, the rape kits were kept, but, and at that point, I don't know when it was destroyed. They were kept in our possession at that time. But at some point, with these small, at least I learned with small places, we had to do something to get rid of evidence, and it was based on the courts.
Further questions, Senator Hutchins?
Mrs. Lone, so you're saying you have a problem with this bill, or you like the fact that we want to keep the DNA for as long as possible? Because we know that in the future, there may be a case similar, and then they check the database and wow, this person raped someone back here, same DNA, blah, blah, blah. So what exactly was it you were saying?
I just, Chairman Baldwin and Senator Hutchins, I just have a little concern only over the fact that will this override the court decisions, or 50 years is, truly is a long time. I would think this is kind of a complicated case that happened, especially with the marriage and things like that. And the fact that this man had served some time for that, the rape, I would just question things like that. It's such an individual situation.
Further questions?
No.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Long. We
Okay,
appreciate seeing you.
thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Very much. Okay, you're up, ma'am.
Good morning, Chairman Baldwin, committee members. My name's Tara Muir, Public Policy Director with the Domestic Violence Sexual Assault Coalition here in Wyoming. Just to be helpful for the committee, and I with the pace of the session, I haven't been able to check in with Representative Eklund. The statute that he's amending is a new statute that was just created back in 2019 by another good senator to address backlog of rape kits. At the time, testimony was we really didn't have a deep backlog at all in our state, even though other states had a significant backlog. What Senator Ellis was able to do is say clearly, we don't destroy the evidence until the statute of limitations has run. And the question then was, well, when does the statute of limitations run? It's like, it doesn't on sexual assault. There is none. So back in 2019, the bill that passed said there's no reason to get rid of this evidence unless there is a court order and individual circumstances in a particular case, and the court would order it. What, at the time, if we wanted to be ideal, we're like, well, let's test all the kits. So we put that DNA into a database. But we weren't ready to do that then. So storing the evidence until the statute of limitations runs is what the current law says. And I think it should stay that way, because I agree with Senator Bouchard, which I rarely do. But I agree, this complicates it, throws out some arbitrary deadlines, which we didn't have before.
Mr. Chair,
Senator Barlow. Oh, go ahead, Senator Hutchins.
I'm chomping at the bit. You said there's a current statute. Can you give that to me?
The one that's in this bill, 62309,
Okay,
and it might just been a new part
It's
of
at the
that
bottom.
section.
right, thank you.
In like Nancy was the new subsection created back in 2019 that he's amending here.
So, second question, Mr. Chair, if I can.
Go ahead.
You are in agreement with Senator Bouchard and myself that right after the word destroyed, we just need a period. And Senator Barlow.
Go ahead.
On line 16, page 1. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, sure.
Mr. Chairman, through you. It could be that, but I think there's no departments here to talk about their process, which I wish they were. I think it just should go back to what it was previously. That kept the until all applicable statutes of limitations have expired. Because then departments can say, hey, the statute of limitations just run, there's no way to even bring charges. If anyone wants to create more statutes that make sure we process those kids, we'd love to talk about that.
Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me recant what I said before, because I understand what you're saying. So some of these things are already rules in the courts, and how the Supreme Court has set it up and how we do it. So when it says no evidence, and then it says record reporter, there could be cases where they, for instance, they have a case that they heard and they've decided to destroy the evidence because the case was bad. They couldn't prosecute, and it was the rights of the person that was being charged. So by us changing any of this here, we could disrupt all of that, and they've already figured that out. So am I correct in that thinking?
Ms. Muir.
Mr. Chairman, I believe so.
Further questions? Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I want to dig into the statute of limitations a little more, because the way this statute is structured, N, which is the language we're talking about, 309, refers to A, and A, report of sexual assault. And then in the last sentence of A, it says, upon consent of the victim, they can release this to law enforcement. So actually what we're talking about is whether we gathering the evidence, and subsequently the victim has the authority to release it to law enforcement. So if it's not released to law enforcement, it doesn't exist to begin with. Is that accurate, Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Muir.
I believe so, and we do have a whole anonymous reporting system. So at least the evidence can be collected very close to the time of the crime and can just sit there until the victim says, all right, now I'm ready to put my name on it and have it go forward, which I think is part of this language.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, follow-up would be, so sexual assault and I can dig into Title 6 further, but sexual assault in itself is a crime with no statute of limitations. Did I understand that from your testimony?
That is what I have learned while being in Wyoming, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions, committee? Senator Dodd?
Ms. Muir, and if you say again, you said you were something with public policy. I need to hear that again. And then why you're opposed to a 10-year minimum. Thank you.
Go ahead, Ms. Muir.
I'm sorry, can you?
What organization are you with? You said you're with public policy for what?
Yeah, thank you. I'm the Public Policy Director of the Wyoming Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. We're a statewide organization, 23 programs,
Yeah,
every
I'm
county,
familiar now. I just,
reservation.
you're opposed to the 10 years because of 10-year minimum?
Yeah, what we are supporting is to keep the law the way it is, that there be no destruction of anything until statute of limitations or court order. What a lot of the testimony was, and it was in the national headlines back in 2019, was if you're raped, it takes so long to come forward, be able to bring yourself to face a court. It can take your whole life sometimes. So having no statute of limitations, which we've never had in Wyoming, coupled with don't destroy the evidence, sometimes it's just, the size of a cereal box, the evidence, so it can be stored for that long. So we would support no amount of years at all, just when the statute of limitations runs.
Thank you.
Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there anything in this bill that you like?
Ms. Muir.
Yeah, I hesitated to come up here because I didn't study every single change. I think when this bill or these set of laws were done in 2019, it was very thorough. I mean, they are adding a couple of extra words around no evidence and being clearer about record, report, or other examination results or analysis. That's helpful. If we do test the kit and run the DNA against other DNA, which is always the most helpful thing to do, that is a good addition. That would be like page 1, line 14 and 15.
Follow-up, Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if we took the current bill so you like the language where it says record, report, or other examination results or analysis, and we put a period after shall not be destroyed, and then we struck everything on the next page, so page 2, line 2 through 6, and we struck that out. Is that, but I also want to know, what about the rest of the bill? Do we do something and disrupt something that's already in the process now?
Ms. Muir.
Thank you. I don't see that any of the other changes really impact what we're talking about, because it does reference back to this paragraph we're focused on, page 1, top of page 2. I would advocate, though, keeping in all that language on line 16 of page 1, line 1 and 2 of page 2 that's been struck. I would keep that and put the period after page 2, line 2, destruction.
Further questions, committee? Oh. Further questions, committee? Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Anyone else in the room wishing to testify to this bill? Come on back up, Representative. Okay, is there anyone online to testify to this bill? We do have one, so let's bring that person in.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this becomes more and more interesting because we still don't know where the statute of limitations would take us and how long that period of time might be. And I don't have a problem with reinserting that. That would be fine. I think there are reasons why you want to keep this evidence, and it isn't just in years forward trying to figure out if there is this alleged perpetrator is that, or if that person is innocent. The evidence could help everybody in this, having that evidence around maybe years later. So I still question the statute of limitations. There are, let me correct a couple things. This man was in prison for child pornography. He wasn't in prison for uh, for rape. And a couple years later, when the girl was 18, is when she married him. And that becomes a real complicated situation, really complicated. But nonetheless, evidence that might have been needed 15 years later in this case was gone. And I don't know, I checked with DCI, they'd had no digital record of the rape kit ever being processed there. It was collected at the hospital, but it was disposed of by the sheriff's department, is what her understanding was in the deal. So, but as far as reinserting that language, I don't have a problem with that. But if we don't really have an idea of how many years evidence might be kept, then I think we probably need at least some kind of an idea what the time period should be.
Okay, let's go ahead and take this last online testimony, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss that as we work the bill. So somebody's online.
Mr. Chairman, I admitted John Worrell.
John, we can't see your face, but can you hear us?
Yes, I can, Mr. Chairman, and I don't know why you can't see me. I've been messing with my camera for 3 days, but my apologies for that.
It's okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm here on behalf of the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police. I want to tell you, first off, in a general way, we have no objection to this bill. There are a couple things I want to tell you to help you make some decisions, and then one observation about something I would like you to consider. First of all, in Wyoming, there is no statute of limitations on any criminal case. So the use of the term statute of limitations in one of our statutes is kind of oxymoronic. But secondly, DNA is collected already by ordering a judgment and sentence from all convicted felons, and that's maintained at the state level. Now that I don't believe would have helped the case that the sponsor of the bill is speaking to, and so I want to address this as well, and I think Kara will support me on this. Right now, if a rape kit is done, and I'm using that as an example, but if a rape kit is done at the hospital, whether or not charges are ever brought, and the language that refers to the idea that unless the victim consents, or if the victim consents to the release of this to law enforcement, it's actually a little different than that. It's they consent to the use of that in a prosecution. And sometimes people don't. And Ms. Muir is absolutely correct when she speaks to the idea that victims of sexual assault are affected in a myriad of different ways. Some become angry and very proactive, and some it destroys them, and they can't work themselves up to the idea that they would have to face their rapist or the person that sexually assaulted them again. So these kits are, I think the national standard is 50 years. Okay, so 10 seems a little limited, but it may be better to stick with the national standard on that, or take out the word statute of limitations or leave them in, because we have none, would be fine with us. But these kits still, whether rape kits, for example, if one is done, they have to be kept until the victim, whether or not there's ever been a criminal charge filed, consents to their destruction. Which brings me to my point. And that is, when I was considering what I might say about this bill this morning, I was a little puzzled by this particular bill, which governs evidence in criminal cases, was coming to revenue, but then it struck me it's a perfect place for it. Because I read the fiscal notes. They are no impact at the state level and otherwise indeterminable due to unknown cases. What that means, loosely translated, is this is a cost that's going to be borne by each and every of the 23 counties in the state and the various agencies there, some of which may have the budgetary ability to handle the storage of a large amount of refrigerated DNA evidence and other such things. But they'll reach a point in time, even if you got 10 years, but especially if you go out to 50, where the ability to store that stuff would require a warehouse, even in a county, to store the evidence that is collected. That is a considerable expense that the counties would then have to bear, or the cities, as the case may be. What I want to suggest to this committee, being as how you are the revenue committee, is if you would consider an appropriation of some amount to assist law enforcement agencies in the storage of evidence that you're going to require them to keep, rather than simply pass that cost on to them and call it a savings. Thank you.
Just one small correction. We have no aspirations to be the revenue committee. We are the labor and health committee, but
I apologize. I was before the revenue committee a couple days ago.
yeah,
My
we don't,
comments still stand,
yeah.
and maybe it's going to take a lot of labor too, so we should consider that.
It's-
But I apologize for, it's early in the morning for me.
I think we got
So,
questions here for you. I think Senator Dockstader has a question for you.
I'll hold and wait for the sponsor. Thank you.
Oh,
Mr. Chairman.
go ahead, Senator Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, my question is this. I pray that we never have so many rapes in Wyoming that we need warehouses to store the evidence. So with DNA, from what I gather, the DNA could be the size of the tip of a pencil. Am I incorrect in that?
you're not, but a rape kit is substantially greater. By the way, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Senator Hutchings. Senator Hutchings is not incorrect. It can be a minute amount, but a rape kit is a substantial amount of material, sometimes clothing, a whole series of swabs. It is not just a minute particle. It could be,
Yeah.
but it isn't necessarily so. And then more often than not, it's a bag full of evidence. Thank you.
Yeah, typically I would compare it to a garbage can full, a kitchen garbage. It's the size of the one here behind us with the clothing and with the actual DNA evidence. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it seems like this forever retention of this evidence is already in place because the law was passed in 2019. So what has been the actual impact to the agencies? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, sir.
Is the question to me?
Yes, I believe so.
Oh, my apologies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Barlow. I can only speak to the place where I was recently the county attorney, and that's Washakie County. And even there, former Sheriff Rackness and I, who retired on the same day, met on this subject on a number of occasions. When the bill came up in 2019, we met on it, and he had concerns because he already had a lot of those kits stored. I mean, we're talking, I think he has had, because he's not the sheriff anymore, but I believe they still have between 50 and 70 in Washakie County. They have a room with a refrigerator in it for the DNA stuff. But they have a room in the sheriff's department, which isn't that large, where this stuff is stored, and they're running out of room. And that's just us, that we're small. And I'm totally agree with the good Senator Hutchings that I wish there was none. But when you have to keep it, whether or not there's been a charge, and I have no problem with that. But when that has to happen, that means there's a lot of things that we don't know because they've never seen the light of day, other than with the victim and with the people that helped with the storage kit and with the storage of saving. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Senator Dockstader.
I'll go
Oh.
with your sponsor, sorry.
Representative. Anything to
Okay.
add?
Yeah, do you want to speak before I ask you a question? Okay. Mr. Chairman, Representative, your thoughts on the 10-year, eliminating the 10-year minimum. I wish the folks from sexual assault, they do a good job, but I wish they would have been with you earlier on that in the process. But your thoughts on eliminating that, and any solutions you have for that storage issue. Thank you, Representative.
Representative Eklund.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Senator Dockstader, we're getting to the heart of my biggest concerns, and that was evidence storage and the cost. When I started, because I did this and then I started researching, which you shouldn't do, but that's just how it works when you're in a hurry. The 10-year deal could go away. I think it's confusing to me. It's been explained as at least 10 years after the victim would have died. In either case, evidence would go away. I'm starting to understand the statute of limitations is probably just a moving target depending on what the policy would be in whatever law enforcement. And the circumstances too. I still think you kind of need the court to be able to rule in the deal. I'm baffled as to, okay, getting back to what I think happened here. The evidence was thrown out after this girl recanted on the situation. And a reason why it's not a good idea to get rid of that evidence and the statute of limitations shouldn't have applied to this rape kit. She was groomed at age 16, married at 18. And it's just one of those cases that the DNA evidence would have been beneficial to have been kept. But I still think I don't know how we sort this out without muddying up law as it is. But this happened previous to 2019. Also, that's one of the things that's coming out here. 2019, we had some revamping of this law, so I'm not sure how it would apply if it happened today.
Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, that's where I'm at, is the 2019. The change that happened in our statute would have probably fixed this if in that case. So I don't know if we are going forward just muddying the waters here, since the courts already have decided this is the way we handle it. We know now that there's no on sexual assault, there is no statute of limitations. So I'm trying to figure out where we're going. I mean, you do understand that there is no, we've had testimony that there is no statute of limitations on sexual assault.
Representative
Yes,
Eklund.
Mr. Chairman, I do. And been through a set of attorneys that seem very unclear on what the new law does, apparently, because here we are trying to sort that out and finally get someone in who starts talking about what the new statute says. And this is my first day of news on what that new, how that new statute applies. And the language is just, getting back to statute law, the language in it just isn't clear to most of the public, myself included.
Very good. Further questions, committee? Seeing none. I believe we've heard all the testifiers online. Is that correct? We've heard everybody in the room. Let's go ahead and close public testimony.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, we
Oh.
do have another hand up.
Oh, we got another hand up.
I admitted Laura Pearson.
Ms. Pearson, can you hear us? Ms. Pearson?
Hello,
Go ahead, ma'am. Introduce yourself again and go ahead and testify.
hello, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Laura Pearson. I wasn't going to testify on this bill. So I realize that you're saying that there is a statute of limitations on rape or rape kits. But what about the statute of limitations on, say, a murder? Say that there's a crime scene, a murder scene, and there's DNA evidence there, but they can't find that in their database. And later on, that person comes into the database. So I don't think that this bill is necessarily only focusing on rape kits. And so that would just be my question. What is the statute of limitations on somebody that is murdered that maybe hasn't been raped, but there is DNA evidence there, but that person, that perpetrator hasn't been brought into the database yet. But later on, say 20 years later, all of a sudden they get a hit.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Pearson. There's no one here left at the front table to answer your question, so I'll let you pose those questions as a testimony, okay? Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
joining
you,
us.
Mr. Chair. Laura, if you would hold on
Yes.
1 second. If you look at the title of the bill, we are talking just about sexual assault, biological
Okay.
evidence. Thank you.
Ms. Pearson, anything?
Okay. Thank you. No, I just was listening to your testimony, so.
Thank you. We've gathered up all the testimony from out there. Okay, thank you. Committee, what's your pleasure? Okay, consideration. Bill's been moved. Past chairman, or the current chairman has not asked for a second. Bill's been moved for sake of discussion. Go ahead, Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think actually I think that the new language, or the stricken language and new language, bottom of page 1, i.e. until all applicable, and then 1 through 6, I would actually get rid of, I would go back to the original language. But I do think there's some value in the addition of on line 14 and 15 of record report, other examination results or analysis. Because that may be something that there can be some discretion. The court can say, get rid of the physical evidence, but keep all the records, keep all the results. I don't know if that's how a court would use it, but it seems that there may be some value in that. Overall, though, and I'm sorry that, very sorry that Senator Ellis hasn't maybe taken a look at this and given us some feedback, since this was new statute just 3 years ago. So I don't know. I guess I'm hesitant to move it forward. I did it for the sake of discussion, so I
Understood.
could actually outline this.
Senator, do you want to make the amendment to make the change, or?
Well, I guess I'd like a little more feedback if the committee
Okay, let's
decides.
do that.
If there's not any interest in moving it forward, then
Let's
no,
move to.
I think. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Other committee members as well. We're going to excuse our chairman. He's got overlapping responsibilities. Senator Hutchings, do you have something to follow up with?
Not just yet, Mr.
Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So here's where I'm at on this. I've looked at the court's books when they decide how they're going to run procedures. I've seen on different cases how they handle things. But when we start making statute, we change those things that they've already been doing. The change that happened in 2019 looks like it's fixed things. So I think we may be breaking things. So that's where I'm having a problem. And I think there's a much bigger conversation that has to be had. We should have a DNA database that's in DCI and take it off the backs of all the individual departments. So I think we need to have that discussion, but I'm hesitant to make these changes here until we heard from the courts, and because I think we're breaking things. So.
Thank you, Senator. Any further? Yes. All right. Senator Barlow, what's your wish on that amendment?
Mr. Chairman, so I think one of the things to point out in this is there was certainly potentially a crime, grooming, et cetera, but the evidence is actually being sought in a civil matter. So this is not a using evidence. This is actually, at least the evidence that generated this interest by a very respected colleague of mine, going to be used in a civil matter, i.e. a divorce and a custody battle, not in a subsequent or other criminal matter. At least that would be, at least that's how it was presented. Unless there is, of course, a complaint that the first child was the result of rape, then that, maybe that throws that all out. But I did not get that from the testimony. So I think there's also that just modest complication, but yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, just to add in a little commentary there. People make bad choices. I don't want to make those bad choices disrupt the victims on cases going forward of, you know, a sexual assault, where we're changing things because somebody previously made a bad decision to say, hey, you know, he didn't do it. That caused a ripple effect in that case, which I don't think means something going forward with other sexual assault cases.
Okay, thank you. Bill's been moved. No amendments. Ready for the roll call? Roll call.
Thank you, Senator. Evidence Preservation, House Bill 172, Senator Barlow, Senator Bouchard, Senator Dockstader, Senator Hutchings, and Chairman Baldwin has voted aye. We have 2 ayes and 3 noes.
Thank you. House Bill 172 has failed Labor and Health Committee. Senator, Representative Eklund, thank you for your presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Next bill up for our consideration, House Bill 119, Medical Prescriptions Off-Label Purposes. Representative, thank you for joining us. State your name and present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Labor and Health Senate Committee, for allowing me the opportunity to present this bill before you this morning. So we have House Bill 119, Medical Prescriptions for Off-Label Purposes, which passed the House with very favorable support. If I may, I'd like to give a little bit of background on how this originates and where this comes from. So 20 to 30% of all prescribed medications are actually done so for off-label purposes currently. What does off-label mean? So off-label, the definition of that simply is that the drug wasn't FDA tested and approved for that specific use, or that it isn't listed on the label, but it has gone through the FDA process of approval. So the FDA, what do? They focus on market entry of drugs. They consistently maintain that they do not regulate or interfere in the practice of medicine between a patient and a physician. FDA clearance means that FDA clearance of a medication ensures that a physician understands that a drug effectively produces certain physiologic actions that are proven to treat an illness, but it's the physician, not the FDA, that determines whether these specific physiologic effects will be useful or beneficial with respect to their particular patients. So we have a need to protect and preserve the integrity of the practice of medicine and allow providers to retain their autonomy to use their clinical judgment and benefit their patients. Patients need providers to have the latitude to make the best choices for them individually and specifically. So what drugs are we potentially discussing here? Let me just go through a list of several of the most commonly prescribed medications for off-label purposes. Gabapentin is an anti-seizure medication, but we commonly use it for treatment of chronic pain, post-surgical pain, shingles, alcohol dependence, tricyclic antidepressants, amitriptyline. We commonly use that for treatment of headaches and migraines and insomnia. Drug classes oftentimes are very commonly prescribed: cardiac medications, anticoagulants, or blood thinners, medications to treat arrhythmias. Antipsychotic or psychiatric medications are once again very commonly used for this purpose. And other specific individual things, albuterol inhalers. We know how that works because of the FDA approval process. It works as a bronchodilator, so it's approved for the use of asthma. We understand that the disease process that it treats is also present in other diseases as well, and therefore may have beneficial use in things like COPD, reactive airway disease, other disease processes. And so we commonly use those things for those purposes. So the question then comes, if it's already done, it's not illegal, why do we need this bill? And I would venture to say that the events of the last 2 to 3 years have helped us understand that this practice may actually be at risk. This right was taken away from patients and providers who were warned, sometimes threatened, about prescribing for off-label purposes. That created a situation where providers may have been uncomfortable or unwilling to provide those medications because they were concerned about their risk of loss of license or loss of livelihood. And we'll hear testimony today. I am confident that in Wyoming, there have been providers who did lose their livelihoods because they continued to practice and do what they felt like was best for their patients. But ultimately, what happened is many people lost access to those potentially life-saving medications and lost their confidence in the system as a whole. So the boards will say, and it is true to my understanding, that no providers actually lost their licenses in Wyoming for continuing these practices. Providers were fired from their facilities or from their clinics, but no one actually lost their license. However, there were warnings issued that encouraged, to put it nicely, these providers to refrain from these practices. I have an article here from a Wyoming publication dated March of 2020. The title or the headline of which says, "Wyoming Medical Board Warns About Using Malaria Drugs for COVID." And in there, the board says that if you're inappropriately prescribing these medications, that would be a violation of the Medical Practice Act, and that they would take action. And so those things were certainly put out there. The Federation of State Medical Boards, of which Wyoming is a member, issued a statement in July of 2021 that said that any spread of misinformation or disinformation would put an individual, a prescriber, at risk of disciplinary action by state medical boards, including the suspension or revocation of their medical license. In fact, I had a local physician or a Wyoming physician reach out and provide a copy of that letter from the Federation that he received that said those things, that if you continue these practices, then your license may be revoked and your certification may be put at risk. So what we have here, in my opinion, is a situation where the threat of discipline was in many cases as effective as the discipline itself. People ended up losing access to the cares that they desired and they wanted. And I truly believe that lives were lost. And in these situations, we have medications that were the excuse was used that we can't do this because it's off-label and because it hasn't been studied for these specific uses, and therefore we're not going to allow it. When these medications have actually been around for 35 years and been, in fact, they're over the counter in a lot of countries. While at the same time, other medications that, I guess I'll put out there that when we're talking about the treatment of COVID, all medications were off-label. We had nothing that had gone through the FDA process and approval for treatment of COVID. And so some medications were villainized and other medications were lifted up as being acceptable. But ultimately, the patients were the ones that suffered and lost access to their options. So again, why do we need this now? Because we have an opportunity to learn from the events of the last couple of years, and we need to be prepared for what may come next. So if there aren't any questions on that, I will take you through the bill.
Okay, go ahead. Let's double check questions before we do that, committee. Take us through the bill.
All right, thank you. Page 1 there isn't too much there. We mostly, things start on page 2 we start with this, with definitions. So the definition of disciplinary action includes any action taken by boards or facilities. We already discussed the definition of what off-label indication means. We know what pharmacists are, hopefully. And in this bill, the list of prescribers on page 3 that are included would be physicians, physician's assistants, dentists, optometrists, nurse practitioners. So statute 33-1-402 in paragraph A on page 3 says that prescribers may lawfully prescribe and pharmacists are authorized to dispense off-label medications with a valid prescription order. These things in section B indicate, or this bill does not apply to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs, which would be things like narcotics or marijuana, and Schedule 1 drugs are typically not prescribed at all. Page 4, paragraph A basically says that no adverse action will be taken solely, and I draw your attention to that. So page 4, line 8, solely on the basis for off-label indication. So adverse action won't be taken solely on the basis that this was an off-label prescription. And lower in that paragraph, it's not considered unprofessional conduct if the prescriber has obtained the informed consent of the patient, specifically acknowledging the off-label indication and use. Paragraph B, which at the bottom of line of page 4, which moves into page 5 and is the final paragraph in this bill, says that also it wouldn't be considered unprofessional for a doctor to recommend prescriber give opinions on the treatment of COVID. I might, if it's considered friendly by the committee, suggest a possibility of some amendments as I looked through the engrossed copy and saw some of the amendments that had made on line 6, page 5. I might suggest putting a period after the word patient and striking the remainder of that line and line 7. That exact language is found in the previous paragraph as well, and it does seem a little bit out of place here, but if that's not considered friendly, it's fine to say as is. I also might make a suggestion that the effective date be moved up to immediately.
Representative, give us that one more time, and somebody may do that then as we.
Both of those.
Yes,
So-
we got the effective date, but what was the other one?
Page 5, line 6, a period after the word patient, and strike the remainder of that line and line 7.
Thank you. Okay, continue.
With that, I stand for questions.
All right, committee questions for Representative Penn. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, so I have 2. One is prescriber. It seems like we've left out 2 prescribers, podiatrists and psychiatrists in this. And I believe they're both have full or prescriptive authority within their scope of practice, just like a dentist would within them. That's the first one. And then the Schedule 2 actually interests me I've got Schedule 2 in front of me, and it includes a lot of commonly used drugs, including fentanyl. So is fentanyl used in ways that are not on the label? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Penn?
And any other drug under Schedule 2, because this would seem to limit any off-use label of Schedule 2, which are commonly used in our drugs, some of them. Thank you.
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Barlow. So your first question about prescribers, so it does include physicians, and podiatrists and psychiatrists are MDs. And so that should include them. If you feel like there's an amendment that needs to be made to include others, I would be agreeable to that. And the second question on the Schedule 2, so fentanyl is a pain medication and would be considered on label to treat pain. And so I'm not certain what other off-label indications you might be referring to.
Senator Barlow, follow up?
Mr. Chairman, so thank you. So because this is actually by practice and by practice board, podiatrists have their own board, and so do psychiatrists. So that's why I'm asking. Granted, they may be MDs, but they have their own licensing authority. At least that's my understanding, and there's other folks in the audience speak that. The second one is, I use fentanyl as an example. There's an entire list of Schedule 2 in Title 35. Maybe it would be, at your leisure, and that'd be today, take a look at that and see if there are other pharmaceuticals in that are used off-label.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr.
Representative
Chairman.
Penn?
Thank you, Chairman. I think that that's a appropriate thing, and I can certainly look into that. I think that the reason that the Schedule 1 and 2 drugs were included in this bill is because they are higher level, higher risk medications. As I said, at this point, this practice is not considered illegal. I don't think that this bill would make the practice illegal if it's not specifically listed here.
Okay, committee, further questions for Representative Penn? I've got one before we cut you loose. Since we've spoken, I've received lengthy correspondence from one of my providers who speaks for many of his colleagues and providers here and her colleagues. They note that they prescribe these medications for off-label use regularly within our practices. In fact, 1 in 5 of all prescriptions in the United States are prescribed off-label. How would you respond to that, Representative Penn?
I would agree with that. Like I said, 20 to 30%, depending on which studies you look at, of all prescribed medications are done so for off-label purposes. And so we currently do that. As I said, the reason for this bill is to ensure that that's a statement, that it is okay, as the practice or the prescribing of off-label medications, that was used as an excuse for entities to block the prescription of certain medications.
So Representative Penn, you've kind of already touched on it then. If we're doing this, the necessity of your bill, why do you think we really need it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the reason that we need this is to allow that relationship to continue, allow the practice of medicine to continue, because I foresee with the events that happened in the last couple of years and seeing how other states have handled this, we have states who have actually enacted laws that simply say that the spread of misinformation is now subject to legal review. And their definitions, in fact, I have the bill in front of me, their definitions for misinformation, the definition for disinformation is misinformation, and the definition of misinformation is false information. And my question in that situation would be, who gets to determine what is false and what is true? That's the reason that we have physicians, and that's their job, is to go through the data, go through, and especially in situations like emergencies and things like that, to be able to repurpose medications and look at what's available, look at how they work, and see if that might have applicability to address the issue that they see before them. And so because we saw an effort, what appears to be a concerted effort to hamper that practice in some situations, I think we need to step up, and Wyoming needs to be one of the first. So this bill is modeled after legislation that has passed in 2 other states. And so we aren't the very first, but we need to be leading that charge to say that we will protect this right in this practice. I think that oftentimes the entities in a discussion here put out that the reason that this was done was to protect patient safety. And we want to believe that, but I've been approached by many who have said, if this is what protection means, we don't want that protection, because if that protection means that we've lost the ability to have all the options, then it's no longer protecting. And so this bill aims at truly protecting the patients.
Thank you. All right. Oh, one follow-up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and Representative Kennedy did a really good job. So my whole take on this is we're just codifying into law a practice that is being done, and we're saying we want you to keep doing this. And if people are agreeable to testing out different drugs off-label, then we want them to have that ability. Is that correct?
Representative Penn?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchings, yes, I would agree. It's a practice that's already happening. We want this to be the official authorization that is to occur. And we want to protect our providers in effort to protect that relationship that we discussed. We want to protect providers' ability to stand up for their patients. And so again, preventing action taken solely on the basis that a medication was prescribed off-label. So this doesn't prevent a board from, if negligence occurs or if there's harm done because of negligence, that doesn't, it's not involved here. This is to prevent discipline strictly because it was off-label.
Thank you. All right, follow up?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. So what I also gather from this piece of legislation is that the physician knows what they're doing. They're not just, hey, do this. They understand what the drug's gonna do to this person.
Go ahead.
Is that correct?
Thank you, Chairman. Senator Hutchings, yes. Physicians and prescribers have gone through the proper levels of training to understand the things that they're prescribing. And so, yes, I would agree that the education is there to make informed clinical judgments.
Thank you. Further? All right, thank you, Representative Penn. Any other legislators before we go to agencies? Legislators, and let's keep it tight and brief. We still have one more bill after this. Thank you, Representative. State your name and say what you'd like to say. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alan Slagle, House District 2. I just wanted to reinforce the statement that Representative Penn presented about providers receiving a letter from the medical boards threatening that they would take away their license and really pursue that avenue. And I don't think that's right. And it's just because of this use of off-label drugs that they were wanting to do that. And with that, I will stand for questions.
Questions for Representative Slagle? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Any other legislators? Let's go to state agencies. All at one time. Come on up. Start with you, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Stephen Johansson with the Wyoming Department of Health. I'm joined to my left by Dr. Corey Cooper, who is a pharmacist and heads up our Wyoming Medicaid pharmacy program. We'll be brief. I wanted to keep our comments focused on the Medicaid program. As the committee is probably aware, we operate under some pretty strict guidelines when it comes to authorizing payment for services, in this case for prescriptions under medical necessity. I'll let Corey describe some of that nuance as it pertains to the Medicaid program. But first, just wanted to inform the committee that as I read this bill, and certainly don't have to get into the weeds conceptually here, but as I read the bill, I worry about some of the administrative requirements that we would have in the Department of Health in some of those federal requirements and guidelines, where we would essentially need to put quite a bit of admin in place to prior authorize a lot of drugs if the off-label usage, as is articulated in the bill, continues. Again, specific to Medicaid, where some of that ability for us to authorize payment of Medicaid funds, both on the state and federal side, could be challenged. We could be essentially, again, on the administrative side, put at risk for noncompliance if we don't have procedures in place to prior authorize some of those things. Not to say they wouldn't ultimately be allowed. And many of you have been on this committee for a long time, know that we prior authorize a lot of different treatment and services, costly things, et cetera, that annoys our providers, I'll put it that way, and can sometimes delay that access to care. Is it necessary? Yes, for different purposes, and Medicaid plans, commercial plans do prior authorizations. I just want the committee to be aware of, as I read it right now, what might be required of your Department of Health and your Medicaid program in order to try to comply with both what would be articulated in the legislation and with our Medicaid requirements. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'll ask Corey Cooper, Dr. Cooper, to speak to those issues.
Let's do this first. We're going to ask if there are questions for the director. And at the same time, I'm going to hand it back to our chairman at the same time. So, okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
I do have a question. hearing what you're saying, maybe I'm wrong, but my brain is just rolling here. Did you keep record or track of every doctor's prescription to every patient?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchings, let me ask Dr. Cooper to answer that. I think it depends on if we're talking about prescriptions that need prior authorization or not, but I think Corey could address that.
And let me slip in with that, keeping track. How do you know if a doctor is prescribing something off label to a particular patient? Are you there? Is there some kind of documentation that is being sent to you saying, this, we're offering this to this patient off label? Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchings, if I may, just to tee that up, Medicaid is a little bit different in that generally off-label usage is not allowed unless that medical necessity has been demonstrated. And I think that's the discussion from the prior speaker about what's that dynamic here in terms of access to certain types of drugs versus, you know, patient protections in payment plans like Medicaid, where that safety needs to be guaranteed. But I'll have Dr. Cooper elaborate on that, Senator.
Dr. Cooper.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Corey Cooper. I'm the Pharmacy Program Manager for Wyoming Medicaid and a pharmacist of 20 years. I'm going to start with just a little bit of groundwork, and I think that will get us to the answer to the questions that have been asked. Social Security Act, Section 1927, is really where most of the federal rules are that we have to follow in Medicaid in terms of drug coverage, reimbursement, that sort of thing. And basically 1927 states that we are only allowed to collect federal financial participation, or FMAP, in Medicaid for prescriptions that are prescribed and dispensed for a medically accepted indication. So the definition of medically accepted indication is a little bit broader than what is on label. So there's two ways to get to medically accepted indication. One is going through the FDA process. The manufacturer goes through that process, establishes that a drug is safe and effective for a particular disease state. That is what is put on the label. The manufacturers spent the time and money invested in getting that particular indication on label. Once a drug is on the market, as has been testified to, it can be prescribed for anything by any prescriber. So, and we, of course, in the scope of practice, we assume that that's happening as well. As experience is gained with that drug in the open market, then situations arise where physicians and prescribers want to try that drug for an off-label purpose, for something other than what it was approved for. And so those studies are done outside of the manufacturer. They're done out in the real world, but in a research setting. So those studies are done with an institutional review board approving the study design, protecting the patients, setting out parameters ahead of time that you know, if we reach a certain endpoint, we're going to stop this study if it's clearly not safe for the patients involved in the study. And so through that process, repeated multiple times, we reach a preponderance of evidence that then allows the medication to be medically accepted for an indication that is not on label. And that happens when that medication and indication is then labeled in, or is then listed in a compendia. The compendia specifically listed in Section 1927 are the American Hospital Formulary Service Drug Information, United States Pharmacopoeia, or the Drug Dex Information System, and peer-reviewed medical literature, which would include practice guidelines for various disease states. So those are the two ways. You can be have on-label indication or medically accepted indication through compendia or peer-reviewed literature. If a prescriber prescribes outside of the labeled indication or the medically accepted indications, Medicaid cannot cover that medication. Okay, so That's where we get to prior authorization and the answer to your question, Senator Hutchings, regarding how do we know and do we keep track of every prescription every doctor writes for every patient? We certainly do keep track of the ones that we pay for. And that's something that we have to do, or we're obligated to do, particularly if we want to collect the federal share on those prescriptions. If it is an off-label use or something that we have on prior authorization requiring that the labeled indication be confirmed before we can cover that medication, then we have a prior authorization in place, and we do keep those prior authorizations. So we can go back and look. I want to give you a bit of an illustrated example to hopefully help clear this up. Representative Penn was completely transparent in that this is a practice that is conducted now. Off-label prescribing is done. Off-label prescribing is generally within the medically accepted indications, as just described to you. The example that I have, real-world example, as you can imagine, because there are 51 state Medicaid agencies, since Washington, D.C. has their own, that means there's 51 pharmacy programs, and we're a pretty tight-knit community. And so when we see practices in one state that are concerning in terms of off-label and not for a medically accepted indication, we're networked in with each other, and we might give each other a heads up that that's happening, which is how this situation came about. We heard from another state that they were seeing a lot of naltrexone use in children with autism spectrum disorder. Naltrexone is a medication used for alcohol use disorder and opioid use disorder, although almost exclusively alcohol use disorder at this point in time. There is scant evidence that naltrexone would help with the behavior complications of autism spectrum disorder. In a couple of parts of behavioral complications, but not necessarily broad use. The studies that have been done are quite small, didn't have astounding results. And consequently, that's not considered a medically accepted indication. And so what was required of us was then to go back through our records of any naltrexone that we had paid for and ensure that there was also a diagnosis of alcohol use or opioid use disorder on that patient's profile. And if there wasn't, you bet we were calling the providers who prescribed it and asking what it had been prescribed for. Because we're not under a permissive law with the federal law. We're under a law that says you cannot cover this. So we needed to make sure that we weren't. I use that as an example because that particular use, if it's not on label and it's not medically accepted, is considered experimental. And the last thing anyone wants is for the Medicaid population to become open season for experimental treatment. And so that's why we have to recover on those claims. And that's why we can't allow the prescribing for off-label and not medically accepted indications. So with that, I'll stand for questions. I'm sure there are some. I already see one.
Yeah.
Questions, committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 questions. In another bill, we just put except for Medicaid and Medicare. Will that help? Number 1. And number 2, did Medicaid, Medicare pay for COVID vaccines?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchings, I do not believe that the exception for Medicaid or Medicare would help in this bill. The off-label prescribing is widely accepted. It is legal. We don't want to make it illegal if it's not on label, because there's the medically accepted indication piece of it. There's a label, then there's medically accepted, and then there's completely off-label. And we can cover on label and medically accepted. And I don't, medically accepted is not language used in this bill. And so that's why that exception wouldn't help us out here.
Gotcha.
Okay. And yes, because we are a federally funded program, Wyoming Medicaid did cover COVID vaccines. We also, as long as the EUA was in place for ivermectin and for hydroxychloroquine, we covered those drugs for COVID-19 as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Follow-up, go ahead.
One quick follow-up. The exceptions for Medicaid and Medicaid care, you're just telling us about it. It's not gonna help or not help. This was just for our information that you brought this up.
Dr. Cooper?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hutchings, yes, we're giving you that information because there are financial implications in terms of federal audit. And if the federal government, or specifically the Office of the Inspector General, were to audit our records and find a medication that we had covered for a non-medically accepted indication or off-label, that finding would be extrapolated, and we would be expected to pay the federal government back potentially a large amount of money.
Thank you.
Okay, further questions, committee. Senator Bouchard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm having a hard time with what you're talking about, because I know doctors that have lists and it says this will be covered by insurance or this won't be covered, and the same with Medicaid. So I'm of the belief that doctors are smart enough to know when to prescribe something and when it can be paid for. So I'm just having a hard time with everything, all your testimony, because that's the way I see it. Doctors don't prescribe things knowing that they're going to put their patient at some kind of financial risk. There are lists, there are codes, all those things have been set forth. Would you not agree that they have the ability to know what is covered and what isn't?
Dr. Cooper?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bouchard, I do agree with a caveat. So I agree that yes, physicians have lists. They know what various insurance agencies cover and what they don't. I think what I didn't make clear in my testimony, so hopefully this will clarify, is that if this bill were to pass, because of the federal limitations that the Medicaid agency is under, there would be a much larger list of drugs that we would have to put on prior authorization to ensure that they were being prescribed for a labeled or medically accepted indication, because as Representative Penn observed, the threat of action on someone's license is as good as actual action on someone's license. We all live with that every day. The threat of being stopped for speeding or running a red light is what keeps us from doing those things. And so with this bill taking away any accountability for off-label prescribing, the accountability then would have to come for us from the agency itself, which would mean a larger number of prior authorizations. Just to give you a few numbers, Wyoming Medicaid covered roughly 531,000 prescriptions in state fiscal year 22. We have 2 prior authorization pharmacists who reviewed over 15,000 prior authorizations, and that was obviously before this bill existed, in 1 year. We would have to expand the list of drugs on prior authorization. The list for the physicians would get longer, their administrative burden would get larger, and we would have to hire additional staff to evaluate the prior authorizations that were coming in.
Follow-up, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So CMS has all these lists, and they probably have them in electronic format. So I'm just trying to, grasp what you're saying here. I just don't see doctors running out there saying, hey, let me give rat poison to cure a disease. That's what you're making it sound like. Doctors are very careful when they use off-label. I've talked to them about this very subject. In fact, my daughter would be dead if they didn't use something off-label, and it was to treat a virus, and it was because of a cytokine storm, and they gave her something that was to treat malaria long before COVID came along. But then when COVID came along, nobody would even listen to what, I mean, there are professionals that work in the field that don't even know what a cytokine storm is, and they don't know how to treat it. Yet there are various doctors around the state that were treating that, and I have recordings from a pharmacy that would not give out the prescription. I mean, I almost brought it in today, and I should have it. I see a reporter out there. I think I'll make sure he has it. But when you have a pharmacy even saying, well, we're not gonna give it because we have a letter from somebody, I can't remember who they had it from, where they said they saw a study, we have an access to care problem, because we had people during COVID that were being told to stay home. We had a percentage of doctors in the state that were treating people, keeping them out of the hospital and getting them on their way to wellness. So how do we balance that access to care if we're not willing to say, hey, CMS has all this on records, and we can gather that without a lot of money, put that out there and put a memo out to doctors and say, hey, these are the things you can't prescribe because we can't get it paid for. I mean, don't you think that's a much simpler issue?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead,
Senator
Director.
Bouchard, and knowing that you all are short on time, I'll try to be brief. I think that's the issue here. I think you're articulating the issue where one of the unintended consequences here is that kind of administrative growth that you're mentioning, where absolutely we can put that out, and we will, because we'll have to have longer lists, to your point, of prior authorized drugs, and have that administrative burden on the docs, on the providers, that then again is what's giving me pause here, is not to get in the way of off-label prescribing. I think the intent here, everybody would agree with, is that we want to make sure that that's somehow codified. What I worry about is, given the nuance of our programs, and I'm sure there's others out there, that we create an access to care issue, because we're going to put administrative hurdles by requirement in place that are going to put more steps in place than I think would be necessary absent the bill, if that makes sense.
Hold on for 1 second, Senator. I just want to put this out there publicly so everybody knows this. It's 9:05 right now. We're clearly not going to finish this bill today, which means the bill behind us is probably not going to get heard today. Well, it won't be heard today. So this one will be continued. We're going to go ahead and finish out. We have to leave at 9:30. We'll do more testimony, anybody that wants to testify, but this will be continued into Friday morning. So just that's up front. If there's anybody out there waiting to testify, that's what's going to happen. We will take more testimony, but we won't be moving or working this bill today. So you have a follow-up?
Just one follow-up.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. What about the people who aren't on Medicaid, aren't on any kind of even insurance? What about people who just want to pay and have access? I mean, we're putting a roadblock on one side, but then what about the people that don't have those roadblocks?
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Bouchard, obviously our testimony is geared toward the Medicaid program. And it, in terms of covered lives, we're talking 60, 70, 80,000 people in any given year. So I think it is significant there. I won't speak for the other speakers that I'm sure will testify here from the non-Department of Health world. But in terms of the broader area, again, I think what we're all wrestling with here is a concern that removing accountability to promote something that where prescribing and pharmacological use could be beneficial, we want to strike that right balance where there's accountability and patient safety and also access. So for the broader population, my department certainly has an interest there and a concern, and I want to do what we can to ensure we get that balance right. But our specific concern today on this bill is some potential consequences and an administrative need that your Wyoming Medicaid program would have.
Very good. And I think I speak for all the prescribers. Maybe I shouldn't speak for all the prescribers. Every insurance company has long lists of pre-approved and medically approved drugs. As for those who pay individually, that's another topic altogether. But all insurance companies have long lists, and I'm sure the good representative will tell you horror stories of having to do prior authorizations. And we talked about that. I have long stacks of prior authorizations And potentially we're talking about adding more. So with that in mind, no, yeah, it's your fault. But let's go ahead, introduce yourself and go ahead and tell us what's up.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Matt Martineau. I'm the Executive Director for the Wyoming State Board of Pharmacy. Wanted to be here to try to answer the committee's questions and do what I could to speak or answer some of the things that have come up. I do want to clarify that messaging that was put out by the boards or by other national organizations was not talking about discipline based off of off-label use of medications. The concern was about the inappropriate use of the medications. And as Chairman Baldwin knows as a provider, there are, and Senator Barlow as well, as a veterinarian, there are many elements that are part of the consideration for what is appropriate and inappropriate prescribing. And I understand the concern that they, to codify this, to make it to where this is without a shadow of a doubt an allowed practice. As has been said, it is allowed. It happens all the time in Wyoming already and across the country. But when we're talking about affecting prescribing and the practice of medicine and pharmacy and all these things, a pendulum is often brought up. And very small touches to that pendulum can have really wild swings to what ends up happening with things. And as this committee has heard, and some of the members of the committee sat on the opioid task force that was brought before previous legislatures, the problem that we saw with the opioid epidemic came from the inappropriate prescribing and the inappropriate use of opioid medications. Other drugs have been discussed and how they're used off-label. Gabapentin is one of them. There is concern among a number of states and the DEA about whether or not gabapentin should be a scheduled medication, because when it's used in large doses and when it's used in combination with other drugs, it potentiates addiction and potentiates other sorts of problems. There are other medications, schedules 3, 4, and 5, that again, when they're used off-label and used in combination, they potentiate addiction, and they are, it can be very difficult to distinguish between the legitimate use of these medications to treat legitimate medical needs and the inappropriate use of these medications. And so in the early days of COVID, when some of these medications were first being looked at, the reports that we were getting at the board was that there were not legitimate patient-provider relationships for prescriptions that were being called in by practitioners who were not licensed to practice in this state, who were looking to hoard medications for themselves. And at the time, one of these medications, the hydroxychloroquine, as an anti-malarial, is usually used for, now that I'm in the hot seat, I'm going to forget, lupus and MS, I want to say. And when I was a practicing pharmacist, that was a medication that I routinely ran out of stock on. It was very difficult for me to have on hand. And so when that suddenly became the target of, hey, this could be something that could help, and there was this rush on it, pharmacies suddenly were unable to obtain it. And that put patients who were stable on these medications for legitimate medical purposes at risk of relapse or worsening of their conditions because the pharmacy wasn't able to obtain it. And so the communications that we had sent out was to say that the pharmacists have a corresponding responsibility and they need to use their professional judgment to evaluate the medications and determine what they were going to be doing in dispensing the medications. Nothing that we ever said or did was to look at and say, we're going to discipline anybody because you dispensed X number of prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine or anything like that. I guess with that, I'd like to still emphasize too that the boards, we exist to protect the public. And one of the things that this does from a practice of pharmacy perspective, by making a lot of things off-label, practice of pharmacy and kind of what Dr. Cooper was talking about, a lot of things from the pharmacy perspective is a game of probabilities. Pharmacists are trained to know what the drugs are, what they're used for, what the proper dosage is, all those sorts of things. And when you get into off-label uses, you start to get into grayer areas where you may not know what exactly is being treated. You may not know exactly whether or not that dose is or isn't appropriate. And that can put the pharmacist in a difficult position because on the one hand, they do have to verify the legitimacy of a prescription. They have a duty to do a drug utilization review and make sure that it's appropriate, that it's safe, that they're not going to cause harm. And some medications have what's called a wide therapeutic window, meaning the range of dose between too little and too much is really, really big. So it's really hard to hurt people on some of these medications because that window is so big. But again, when you get into these off-label uses, the pharmacist playing a game of probability gets into those kind of gray areas where they don't know if what they're doing is or isn't going to be causing harm. And again, from the board's perspective, it's not that we would look at a pharmacist and say, well, you definitely did something wrong here, because there's a lot of things that go into evaluating whether or not there was a violation of the rules. And if there was a violation of the rules, what sort of discipline is necessary in a given case. So from the board's perspective, to make it not unprofessional conduct to just be able to fill prescriptions off-label makes the practice of pharmacy much more difficult because you end up having a lot of competing masters to serve, so to speak. I guess with that, I'd try to answer the committee's questions. When I was before the opposite chamber, I was told I was causing more questions to be thought up than I was answering. So I'll stand for questions and let my colleague from the Board of Medicine step in if you would like.
Questions from Mr. Martin, Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So remind me the relationship that the pharmacy board has with other prescribers, i.e. besides pharmacists. I used to have a license with the pharmacy board, and I can't remember what what level was it controlled substances? Was it all prescribing? Would you just remind me and inform the committee? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Marno.
Chairman Baldwin, Senator Barlow, underneath the Controlled Substances Act, the Wyoming State Board of Pharmacy is authorized to administer the controlled substance registration, which is the element that says a practitioner can prescribe, administer, dispense, purchase controlled substances.
Further questions, committee. Senator Barlow.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it's only under Title 35 or under controlled substances that all prescribers are under the has a subsequent license under the pharmacy board. Is that accurate? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Baldwin, Senator Barlow, as you mentioned before, the different practices have their different practice acts. So it does get into what a particular practitioner is or isn't allowed. This committee famously heard a bill for a number of years for optometrists to be able to prescribe a certain Schedule II medication that before it had been scheduled as a Schedule II was a Schedule III. And they had been able to prescribe it while it was a Schedule III. And as soon as it became a Schedule II, they were no longer able to do that. And it took many years for them to be able to get that back into their toolkit.
Further questions, Mr. Martineau, Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So rolling back and looking at what happened, I was told that doctors can prescribe these other drugs for during COVID. But the reality, the situation was doctors were calling me and I was calling the pharmacies and finding out that that was not the case. The pharmacy was saying, well, we're not going to prescribe it because it's not for that, for use for what they're giving it for. So how do we fix that? If it's not this bill, how do we fix it where you're telling me they can prescribe it? And then on the other end, the doctor can't get it, and then the patient's at risk. So I get what everyone's saying, but how do we get to a point where we fix something that we know that there's a problem?
Chairman Baldwin, Senator Bouchard, that is a difficulty, and as you're aware from other bills that have been sponsored or brought to this committee's attention, the practice of pharmacy is difficult in the sense of you are doing things. See if I can say this clearly. Right now, the practice of pharmacy, at least from a retail perspective, because we're talking about an outpatient setting, it's geared largely around reimbursement for dispensing the prescriptions. And so a lot of the behavior that you see a pharmacy do in terms of I will, or the chain or the individual pharmacist or whatever, if they will or they will not dispense a particular medication, there's a ton of factors that go into that. Like I mentioned before, as soon as a drug becomes difficult to obtain or on the shortage list, there's very little that they can do because there's only so much available in the country, and you get on lists to try to get it, or you have to find alternatives, things like that. Again, because of outcomes from like the multi-state opioid litigation that came out, certain criteria have been developed by not just pharmacies, but by payers and lots of other entities in terms of what they will consider something to be appropriate or not, and whether or not there's a risk to them in dispensing these medications. The DEA has a very, very big stick when it comes to controlled substances and violations of the Federal Controlled Substances Act, hence why there's settlements in the usually tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, when a pharmacy is filling, when it's determined that a pharmacy was filling illegitimate prescriptions for controlled substances. And as Dr. Cooper was mentioning, the financial costs and concerns with those things shift the practice in ways that isn't always intended necessarily. And like I say, it's a pendulum, and a small touch here you may think is only going to have a small swing, but because there's a bunch of dominoes that hit before it hits the pendulum, it can end up really sending the thing flying. It does get to be difficult too, because you're talking about the practice of multiple healthcare professionals. And so you might have a prescriber who says, in my professional judgment, this is an appropriate thing to do. But a pharmacy is not obligated to fill every prescription that is presented to them. And the pharmacist may have information, or they just may not agree with the information that's out there. And so we've had, for pharmacies that would not fill medications, we had tons of pharmacies that would. And we had some pharmacies that, because of their contracts with their wholesale distributors, were able to get shelves and shelves worth of some medications, and were more than happy to take all the business in town that nobody else was doing. Access to care in Wyoming is difficult on the best of days, and when you have some communities that only have a single pharmacy, and especially if it's only a single mom and pop sort of pharmacy, they won't have the sort of buying power and the contract sorts of deals that chain pharmacies will have, so they won't necessarily have access to the medications and be able to stock them the way that other pharmacies may be able to do. So it becomes a very multifaceted answer, and I don't know if that's satisfactory to your question.
Mr. Chairman, I have a follow-up.
Let's hold up for 1 second. Let me make a statement here. Is that we got Mr. Blunderbuss up here ready to testify, and I would give this his preference. We've got roughly 5 minutes left to testify. Would you prefer testifying now or continuing the questioning, and you come back on Friday? What's your preference, Mr. Blunderbuss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think probably the questions that are going to be asked me alone are going to take more than 5 minutes, and so I'd like to keep it all together if I could.
Let's bring you back Friday. Let's go ahead and ask the question, Senator Bouchard.
Mr. Chairman, my question was specific to conditions that happened. So you have, some of the things that you missed were alopecia, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune diseases. And when I was in the crazy world we were in, you have a pharmacist talking to someone like me who's not even a medical professional, that I knew more about what they've used hydroxychloroquine for than he did. And he was mentioning a study where they used 4 times as much instead of a correct dosage to deny to filling a prescription. The doctor was very versed in what that drug did. That's what this bill is about. Making sure that the doctor can give his patient treatment. And so how do we fix that? If it's not this bill, how do we fix that?
You can reply if you wish. Not a specific question, but.
Yeah, Chairman Baldwin, Senator Bouchard, I don't know that there is necessarily a satisfactory answer to that, because on the one hand, to put pharmacy in a position where they have to fill every prescription that's presented to them reduces the profession to literally a dispensing function only, to where you could have like red boxes or something similar where you just go in and you get whatever medication. And prescription medications are dangerous substances. They can do harm, they can hurt people, and there's a reason why there's a lot of different people involved in the process with it. The other thing, there again with the pendulum, there's a lot of unintended consequences if you say that you have to fill every prescription that's presented before you. In terms of other controlled substances, this bill doesn't go into Schedule 1 and Schedule 2s, but again, if the pharmacist, again, it's a game of probabilities. If they don't have enough information to make a proper intervention, as a practicing pharmacist, that leaves me with what information am I using to try to help and take care of my patient? Because the pharmacist is always doing their best to put the patient first and foremost in their practice. They don't want to harm the patient at the same time that they're trying to not second guess the doctor and try to practice medicine and override what the doctor is saying. But again, as I mentioned, there's a number of different reasons for why a pharmacist may choose to dispense or to not dispense a medication. Sometimes it's their professional judgment. Sometimes it's the direction from their corporate leadership if they work for a chain. Yeah.
Further questions? Did you have questions? Senator Barrow.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, to be clear, I don't think this legislation has any impact on requiring dispensation. At least I don't read it that it would require any pharmacist to dispense based on receiving a prescription. Second thing I'd say is any prescriber can also be a dispenser. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, with that being said, here's the plan. Team, we have a plan. We're going to come back on Friday and continue this topic. Second topic. Good question, teammate. We will be doing the, I already forgot, the UPL program first. It's on Friday. And then we will follow with this one. And then we will follow with the third topic, and I'll decide that here in a minute. So probably 988. Well, also the one that we put off today. So that's the plan. We'll be back here at 7:30 on Friday morning. And those who online didn't get to testify or had something to say to this bill or 988, we'll see you on Friday, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much, everyone that testified. Thank you, committee. I apologize for skipping out. I went across the hall and filled the seat of